With summer right around the corner, are you reminded of how annoying and possibly unsafe it is to carry around a self-defense firearm with something super impractical like an elastic waistband or a little man purse that we call fanny packs? Especially during intense movement like while running or while weight training. Are you one of those folks that's had to take a belt, put it around your waist, tighten it to the point where it's stabbing at your hips, and then throw your shorts on like a loser? Never mind how stupidly slow all of these things are to actually use. Never mind further how unreliable some of them are and how much some of them print. Well, do I have the perfect solution for you with Arrowhead Tactical Apparel. With the internal retention belt that's really easy to install and adjust, we can easily secure with our regular EDC holster a full-sized or a compact-sized handgun without having to resort to all them tiny things. All of this is easily accomplished without sag or bounce, especially in the appendix position. And while there are lots of styles to choose from like joggers, sweats, hoodies, t-shirts, and the like, my personal favorite are the shorts. Because not only can I keep on working at turning this dad bod into a father figure, I can also easily show off the quads. With the high quality manufacturing and discreet styling to help keep you concealed, Arrowhead Tactical has finally provided athletic clothing for an athletic gun. You can finally be discreet, effective, and best of all, you have a carry method that agrees with you being outside. Use code REGULARGUY to get 10% off of anything in their store. And this stacks with their sales too. Tell them I sent you, and remember, if you want to dress and carry comfy too, Arrowhead Tactical is for you. What if I were to tell you that basically everything negative you've ever heard about the M9 service pistol was basically bull? Turns out Beretta actually agrees with me, because today we're going to talk about that one time that Beretta took the United States government to court over defamation and won. So what's interesting about this whole thing is that this actually kind of reminds me of that one time that SOCOM really tried to call foul over Colt, because they were essentially taking M16 lowers, attaching them to M4 uppers, trying to make that upper do what it wasn't supposed to do in the first place by running them in a whole bunch of full auto, and then calling foul at Colt because a rifle that wasn't designed for tons of that was breaking on them. But the difference between these two cases, and we'll get to that here in just a second, is that when Colt responded, these guys essentially got really quiet and waited for them to make changes, even though they decided to go look for a different rifle, which never really materialized in the first place, because by the time that those improvements had been made to the M4, they had basically rendered every other rifle in what would eventually be known as the SCAR program irrelevant, at least for line infantry use, and at least for a time. But now let's get to the M9. Now, to set the stage for this properly, we have to go to the 1984 XM9 trials. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at essentially the knockout round for this, and you look at the available competitors, all you really have to do is look at 3 individual handguns throughout essentially this knockout. Now, at the time, you have a Swiss importer who's acting on behalf of SIG Arms, known as Seiko. A lot of you may know quite a lot about their bolt-action rifles or various other products that they make. And Beretta comes to the table with the M92 SBF. Now, a lot of people don't really know that this is actually round 2 of these individual trials. The first time that they tried a pistol trial to defeat the 1911, there were a lot of issues with it, particularly with ammunition, which killed all the competitors outright. But then, of course, we try again later on, and here are the basic results for that knockout trial. And essentially, this would forecast things to come during this significantly longer down-select portion of this trial, which lasts over 20-ish thousand rounds. Now, during this knockout round, the M9 and the 226 would sort of go back and forth with each other and completely outclass the 1911 in almost every single category. Now, this is relevant because we really have to talk about the individual numbers on this. For instance, during the reliability portion of this, the M92 would end up with total 20 stoppages, 10 Type 1, 1 Type 2, and 9 Type 3s. The 226 226 would have 12 total stoppages, 11 Type 1s and 1 Type 3. And the 1911 in 45, the 2 World War winner, would have 216, 180 Type 1s, 11 Type 2s, and 25 Type 3s, but that's not really where this ended either. But in this particular phase, the M92 and the P226 would have the highest number of rounds between individual failures by far of all the contestants. And of course, there were multiple contestants other than just these 3 pistols. But in this particular category, the P226 takes the edge, with 8 fewer stoppages. Now, during the Army's mud test, there was actually a wet mud test and a dry mud test. And funnily enough, the handgun that was designed for trench warfare actually did the best out of all 3, because during the wet and dry phase of this test, it experienced 0 stoppages compared to the 92's 3 and 2 stoppages and the 226's 2 and 21 stoppages, bringing the percentile averages to a rather surprising 1911 100%, 92 at 97%, and the P226 at an 88%. And of course, of the new Wonder 9s, the 92 would take the edge in this category, only very slightly behind the 1911. And then, interestingly enough, during the saltwater exposure testing, the 1911 would be the only pistol to experience stoppages after 3 and then 5 days worth of exposure, of which it only experienced 2 after 5 days. Everyone else performed at 100%. And as an aside, this is honestly why I'm not the biggest fan of extreme environmental testing, mostly because it's not exactly super consistent and it doesn't give you a really good forecast of the particular machine's performance overall, even if it is nice to see. Point is, though, is that under general use, both of these 2 Wonder 9s, that would be the 92 and the 226, would vastly outperform the 1911 to such a point where the trial would be permitted to continue, because of course the people administering the testing would see this as well. Now, after this initial knockout round, every other competitor that was in this space was promptly ejected because of their lack of performance, and the end result of both the first and second round would be put into a point-based system. A lot of times, individual points, for instance, would be taken away for individual stoppages that occur per individual tester during the endurance testing, or what they would call a service life test. Now, it's worthy to note that at the end of the second round testing, according to the data sheets that are publicly available, based off of this point-based system, the P226 was actually ahead of the 92, coming in at just over 854 points to the 92's barely over 835 points. However, and this is where the nonsense begins to occur, once cost was factored in, the P226's score dropped to 847 versus the 92's 858. And even if it didn't drop, it still lost out by a grand total of 4 points. Now, this cost isn't factored by just the guns alone, because you also have to figure magazine prices and spare parts packages as well, because as far as guns go, this contract calls for 315,930 units, 1,263,720 magazines, and 31,953 spare parts packages. And this is just to start, because military contracts always grow. So what all of these cost actually does factor quite a bit in the decision-making process. Now, on guns alone, the 92 doesn't win this at all because it came in $2 more expensive than the 226 at $178.50, whereas the 226 came in at $176.33. But where the contract really was decided was based off of the rest of this, because $11.95 per individual magazine for a 226 is just going to get beat out by $9.30 a unit when we're talking about individual magazines, especially when we're talking about 1.2 million of them. Same thing with replacement parts. The 92 comes in at $209 and change, and the 226 comes in at $221 and change. And realistically speaking, this doesn't really sound like all that much until you realize that you're saving about $3 million in 1980s money. Turns out, that's actually a lot, which is why logistics are frankly really friggin' important. And I can't just mention this without mentioning the cost. As far as the point differential between the two, you have to understand that, especially over the course of all this testing that's been conducted, the point differential between these two handguns is just about non-existent, and as far as the overall testing is concerned, it may as well be non-existent. Fact is that at this particular time, these are the two most reliable handguns on planet Earth. Glock doesn't actually exist yet, so as far as individual testing for a military sidearm, there are no better options. Because after the first round, which I went into detail on, and fact is, after the second round of this testing, and once we figured out where parts were going to break and what it was going to take to replace them, the 1911 did not stand a chance, and really no other handgun on the planet stood a chance either. So both of these handguns really are equals. They are performing almost exactly the same under all of these circumstances, and the way that the United States government looks at it right now is, well, if we're going to save $3 million at least on this contract between two handguns that are performing identically, then the choice is made for us. This isn't the case of the M17 where a round 2 never actually happened, which is how we're figuring out all of these parts breakages via service life later than we really should be, with perfect knowledge of where these two handguns are going to perform with the understood service ammunition that they were going to use. Everyone had a great idea of where these handguns would stack up in comparison to the entire planet at this point in time. So what you've heard about the US government picking lowest bidder is really untrue. They just picked a more value-added option because frankly both of the handguns were performing identically, and by the barest of margins. We're talking only a few stoppages over a pretty brutal set of testing. The 226 technically, according to this scoring system, was a little bit barely more reliable, and that really is just not enough when we're talking about this sort of contract. But now that we've laid the foundation, now we can talk about all of the fallout. And boy howdy, there were tons of sour grapes about this contract being awarded in the first place. Some by folks that have a justifiable axe to grind for the most part, and in some ways by people that really had no right to be in the conversation to start. For instance, Smith & Wesson's entry suffered a frame crack in the middle of the first round of testing, which is round about 6,000 or so rounds. They were knocked out of the round 2 simply because of that, and they went to federal court to dispute the claim, saying, hey, the handgun survived, why didn't it get selected for round 2, even though their friggin' frame cracked, and not having some major catastrophic malfunction of anything was clearly part of the testing procedure. But they went to federal court anyway, their case was thrown out. Seiko, who again is representing SIG Arms and the P226 at this point, actually went to federal court also, saying that a price got leaked to Beretta, and that there was collusion between elements within the US government to win Beretta the contract regardless of the outcome. Because, among other things that they had complained about, there were suspicions that those running the test didn't like the fact that their handgun didn't have a manual safety, even though there was never a requirement in the contract for a manual safety in the first place. So that doesn't really make any sense, and as far as the pricing is concerned, honestly, I can kind of see how Beretta just won out based off of dumb luck in that regard, because Seiko is an importer who is representing SIG Arms. There's got to be some sort of price increase in there somewhere, mostly because you essentially have a middleman in here now, and regardless to what anyone thinks, that costs money, and Seiko, understandably, is out to make money for both parties. They had claimed that Beretta came down a considerable percentage from their previous best offer on pricing after they had learned the pricing for the 226 and all of its components. And honestly, I can see how either side of this would work, meaning, yeah, Beretta knew, or no, they didn't, this is just sour grapes from you guys. But again, I could sort of understand Seiko's axe to grind, especially considering they were really close competitors with Beretta. What I don't understand from this time period is multiple manufacturers, a bunch of them actually American, calling for a retrial, saying that the M9 contract was awarded to the 92 and Beretta because they were using hand select products, even though we're in a selection process for a new serviced handgun. Yeah, sure, they're producing the things, but that doesn't really make all that much sense considering you guys could have submitted whatever you wanted into the competition as well and you still lost badly. But they go to the federal government and say, we demand a retrial because of this hand select process that they have. And the US government actually grants this retrial, pulling a couple of M9s straight out of random inventory and subjecting them to the same trial. But you could sort of tell that this was a whole bunch of nonsense too, because a bunch of the original people to make these complaints in the first place never actually showed up to this retrial. And of course the results were exactly the same, only now worse, because Beretta now has economy of scale in their favor, and there's no way anyone else is going to win at this point unless you just create a massively overpowered pistol that would knock it off its throne, which at this time never happened. So post all of these grumblings and all of this stuff that people are trying to stir up and say, especially people within our own military that really wanted to stay with the 45 and the 1911 because they really wanted any service firearm that was in our inventory to be made by Americans or an American manufacturer, something rather peculiar happened. And this next little chapter starts with the Navy SEALs. See, the SEALs were apparently not busy with what would become a time-honored tradition of shooting movies and writing books during this time period. So instead of getting started there, they decided they were going to get started on a different time-honored tradition, and that would be shilling for Sig Sauer, for some reason. See, not too much longer after the 92 from Beretta was adopted as the M9, the SEALs started to experience M9 slides that were just snapping in half on them, the rear of which hitting a bunch of dudes right in the face. This clearly brings up a lot of different alarm bells to our government because SEALs use their guns, they shoot them a lot. And this caused quite a stir, especially with those that are in the government that already kind of hated the fact that we went away from 45 to start. So a mandate comes out that until this is resolved and well understood, or both, military inventories everywhere are advised to change entire slides every 1,000 rounds, and production on current handguns is to halt immediately. And of course, at the same time, somebody from somewhere, I don't know where, likely proposed a 226 to the Navy SEALs and said, hey, why don't you run this? It's better. And so they did. That is exactly how the 226 came into the hands of the SEALs in the first place, and why it's still in their inventories to this day in some capacity. But of course, to try and figure out what is actually happening, because Beretta's never had this issue once, Beretta decides to launch its own investigation into what exactly happened, and they discover that the SEALs are using P plus 124 gray 9mm in their guns. Now, that's a really big deal because this isn't just plus P for a cartridge that's already loaded kinda hot, because military 124 is kinda hot for 9mm. Plus P plus is essentially a proof cartridge, something that you never intend on firing in large volumes unless you're trying to break handguns. And fun fact, while Beretta is discovering all of this, the SEALs would also be cracking 226 frames, but we're not going to talk about that, of course. But either way, we will come right back to that in just a second. So before this discovery takes place, we're talking some real huge issues for Beretta. They are taking a lot of fire from the media. They're taking a lot of fire from talking heads in our own military. They're taking a lot of fire from just a rank and file soldier, because these guys now genuinely believe that the Army adopted a piece of crap. Now, you have to understand this. This is a time period that is not too far divorced from the Vietnam days, where a lot of people still at this point believe that adopting the M16 was a mistake because of Ordnance Corps biases, intrigue, and bullshit that led to a reputation that took the M16, and by extension the AR family, many decades of superb performance to undo. And we're also talking about a lot of cost to Beretta, because everything is shut down while they're investigating this. Production is at a full-time halt, and we're talking about employees just sitting around doing nothing. So for a manufacturer that just secured a military contract and is in the process of fulfilling those orders, this obviously costs them a lot of money. And the reputation hit that they are taking at present is also something that would never fully go away, even to people in the present day that look back on how they thought about the M9, or how they still think about it based off of their either limited military or pistol experience in general. And of course, the guys that really wanted to stick with the 45 started to really push the 2 World Wars meme that has been punched into the dirt for, at this point, 40 years. Yes, that started right here. Now, tangent within a whole video that's a tangent, I'm gonna give you the hard truth pill here. The 1911 has never won a war. If you replaced it with a single action army, it would have had the exact same impact as the 1911 did during both the First and the Second World War. If you really want to talk Browning's contributions to warfare through small arms, and if you don't lead off with the M2 or its 30 caliber counterpart, the 1919, you're out of your mind, because this is what was in every vehicle that we ever had in World War II. Wheeled or not, it's what was on the developing and shifting lines of every movement that we ever did, stopped all the big attacks towards, or in some cases through, our lines, or supported the massive assaults into either front that it was deployed. The 1911 had essentially no bearing on either one of those wars, because that's not how they were fought. They were fought with rifles, machine guns, and vehicles. Knock it off. But this is also where you were told that the military went to the lowest bidder on the M9, and therefore we got an inferior product to the 226, which is frankly just not true. And of course, going back to the SEALs, after they started cracking 226 frames because they were using plus P plus 9mm ammunition like idiots, they would quietly change their ammunition back to the regular NATO standard pressure 124 spec stuff. But of course, they would never admit fault for these issues, because if we're gonna start a new tradition of shilling for SIG, why stop now? But after the discovery of the idiotic change in ammunition, followed by blaming Beretta for the issues they were having, Beretta themselves decided that they were gonna take none of this lying down. So they decided to take the United States government to court over defamation. Now, I think you need to understand how big this is, because at this point, you've heard about a lot of different manufacturers trying to go to federal court over various issues with regards to this handgun program. All of these were thrown out basically immediately, because if you're going to even try to have anything get even remotely looked at as far as cases go, you need to have a real airtight case. And that's just to even be looked at, never mind actually have any sort of process go forward in the first place, because governments really do not change, and they really do not like being taken to task over their own individual actions. But here's where the crazy part actually starts. Beretta won this case, and the case was so one-sided that here were your end results. Not only does Beretta need to be compensated for all the time that was wasted not producing the order that the United States government asked them for, and not only do statements need to be made regarding this situation with the perfect understanding that even if statements were to come out saying, hey, Beretta was actually right, the damage that was done to their reputation would never actually go away. And what's funny is, many of you hearing this for the first time are just now learning about this, having spent your entire adult lives thinking that the M9 was adopted because it was the lowest bidder and was a subpar performer to the 226. This was something that was well known by Beretta, so winning this case would just have to be a start. Not only would the statements have to be made, but they would also have to be compensated for the irreparable damage that a bunch of morons caused with ammunition that the handgun was never designed for. And also thoroughly understanding that a whole bunch of this ammunition is likely still out in the wild, Beretta is now also forced to make a retrofit to their production guns as well as recall the existing units. This is now how we get to the Beretta 92 FS and the difference between the F and the FS. The S actually stands for safety with regards to the slide, because understanding that this sort of failure point could indeed happen with ammunition that was of much higher pressure pressures than they ever tested the handgun for. Beretta actually retrofits their handguns with a slide stop and prevents the rear portion of said slide from hitting the individual user in the face by creating an individual extension as well as a cut in the slide itself, so that even if this problem were to be replicated by morons in the future, you wouldn't have guys catching black eyes from handgun slides. And of course, as part of their lawsuit against the United States government, which they won, which is still crazy to me, they made the United States government, in other words, the taxpayer, pay for all of it. And that would include R&D costs, which they could run up to almost whatever they wanted. So of course, the M9 would go on to serve for quite a few years afterwards. And the thing is that nobody learned a damn thing because it was eventually replaced by a vastly inferior pistol that did not receive anywhere near the amount of testing that the M9 received, because remember, it got the entire M9 trial, that would be round 1 and 2, twice. And of course, a newly minted M17 wouldn't experience a round 2 of a pistol trial ever. And of course, now that military units around the entire United States military have discovered quite a few issues with it, we are just now starting to backlog into legitimate testing to discover its many issues. Which is funny because a lot of people have tried to tell me that me simply saying that the M17 never went through a military trial is hogwash because it was heavily tested by the military in the first place is only technically correct. Because here's the thing, when you never actually complete a pistol trial and then get retroactive testing to discover all of your issues, technically, yeah, the M17 has now, at this point, been heavily tested by the United States government. It's also been discovered to be extremely deficient when compared to the service pistol before it. Because in the modern day, especially now, when you have trouble feeding ball ammunition, when this is something we figured out in the early 1900s, you have a real issue. So I can't wait to see where that goes. But hey, there you go. Now you know. I hope you guys enjoyed this little historical dive. I've been wanting to do stuff like this for quite some time, honestly, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this, because if you did, I'm gonna keep doing it. The idea is to try and shoehorn one of these in a month, mostly because what a lot of people don't know about me is that I was actually supposed to be a history teacher before I started doing the whole instructor thing on my own and in earnest. So there's other stuff that I want to cover with regards to history and that sort of thing, but just little tidbits, and none of these are really supposed to be connected anyway. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. But if you guys want to come out and train with us, you absolutely can do that. We have open enrollment classes scheduled through December. So if you want to check that out, you can take a look at the description below. Also, I do schedule private classes for people that are interested. Now, you guys have taken up a lot of my spare time on this, but if you go to my website, which is also in the link in the description below, you can get in contact with me and we can sort of set something up depending on time and what it is that you want to do and my policies on it and all that. If you want to support us through Patreon, you can absolutely do that too. Throwing a couple bucks at us helps us out way more than you realize, and if you want to get something out of it, $41 a month gets you as much open enrollment training as you would like, unless it is a logistically challenging course, like for instance a soft skin vehicle class, or a private class, for fairly obvious reasons. And if you'd like to check us out on little social media links, especially the new Discord that I just opened up, you can check us out there too. Again, links for all of this are in the description below. And of course, if and only if you enjoyed this little video that we put on today, give us a like and a subscribe, hit the little bell notification because that's a real subscribe button anyway. And remember guys, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.